Now let's move on to the next and last classification basis, that is classification by behavior. In classification by behavior, we will see that how a cost behaves with respect to level of activity. It means that we will see what is the effect on cost if level of activity increases. By behavior, cost is classified into four different categories. The first one is variable cost. Now, what does variable cost means? Now, variable word, it's derived from the word vary, and vary mean changes, a thing that changes. So, variable cost is a cost that varies in direct proportion with level of activity. So, it means that if the level of activity will increase, the cost will increase. So such a cost is known as variable cost. Now you can see two graphs here. The first one is of total variable cost, and the second one is of variable cost per unit. Okay. Now let's discuss an example to understand the variable cost better. Let's say that cost per kg is $3. Cost per kg is $3. Okay, and 1 unit it requires 2 kg of raw material. So we are considering the example of material. Okay, now each kg of material, it costs $3, and 1 unit, for the production of 1 unit you require 2 kg of raw material. So if I have to make 1 unit, so it means my cost will be, because I require 2 kg and each kg is of $3, so my cost will be $6. Similarly, if I want to produce 2 units, now for 2 units, I required 4 kg and cost per kg is 3. So it will be 12. Total cost will be 12. For 3 units, I require 6 kg. So cost per 3 units will be 18. Okay. So you can clearly see, as your level of activity is increasing, it means you require more raw materials. So if you require more raw materials, your cost is increasing. So this increase, it is reflected by this graph. So variable cost in total, it increases, right? Like for 1 unit cost was $6. For 2 units cost is $12. For 3 units cost is $18. You can also plot these figures on the graph and you will get this this type of graph for the total variable cost. So this graph is representing the total variable cost. Now, there are two characteristics in variable cost. Number one, that in total, the cost increases. As your level of activity increases, the cost increases. But the variable cost per unit, it remains the same. It remains the same. So you have to remember this thing, that if you have to classify a cost, if you want to identify that which cost is this, if you want to identify the cost behavior, and if you want to see that whether this cost is a variable one or not, you have to look for two things. Number one, the cost should increase with the level of activity. Number two, the per unit cost should remain same. Okay. Now, with the same example, let's discuss the cost per unit. Now, for 1 unit, cost was 6. So what is cost per unit? 6 divided by 1, that is 6. For 2 units, cost was 12. So what will be cost per unit? 12 divided by 2, again 6. For 3 units, cost was 18. So what will be cost per unit? 18 by 3, that is 6. So you can clearly see that cost per unit, it remains the same. So because the cost per unit remains the same, the graph is a straight line graph. As the level of activity is increasing, there is no effect on cost per unit. It remains the same. So this is the variable cost. Variable cost, example of variable cost, the first one I told you, raw materials, it can be labor, expenses that vary with the production, variable overheads. Okay, so all these are example of variable cost. Now, second cost by behavior is fixed cost. Now, what is fixed cost? Fixed cost is a cost that remains the same within a certain activity level. So, if a cost is same within a certain activity level, we say that this cost is a fixed cost. Okay. For example, rent cost. Now, let's say rent of a factory is $1,000. Now, this rent cost is same regardless of level of activity. It does not matter that how many units you produce. If you produce 1 unit, 2 unit, 5 units, 6 units, even if you produce 0 units, still you have to pay the rent, right? So such a cost is known as fixed cost. It does not depends upon level of activity. Even if your level of activity is 0, still you have to pay that cost. So this type of cost is known as fixed cost. Now there are two graphs here. The first one, the graph one, it's representing the total fixed cost. And the second one is telling us about the fixed cost per unit. Now total fixed cost, you can clearly see that it is again a straight line graph, identical to the variable cost per unit graph. So it is simply reflecting that, regardless of level of activity, you have to incur that cost, and that cost is same. So this is the representation, the graphical representation of total fixed cost. Now, what about the total what about the fixed cost per unit? Now, fixed cost per unit, you can clearly see there's a curved shape graph that is moving downward, which is indicating that fixed cost per unit is decreasing as your level of activity increases. As your level of activity is increasing, there is a decrease in cost per unit. And we can also prove that with an example. Now, let's say that the units you manufacture, they were, let's say, 50 units. So when the production is 50 units, what will be the cost per unit? Cost is 1000 and 50 units. So cost per unit is 20. Let's say you produce 100 units. So what will be the cost per unit? Cost is 1000 and units are 100. So it will be 10. Now, if you will produce, let's say, 200 units. Now, what will be cost per unit? 1000 divided by 200, it will be 5. So you can clearly see that fixed cost per unit is falling. Cost per unit is falling. So this fall, it is represented by this curved downward shape graph. Okay. So this is the graphical representation of fixed cost per unit. Now, examples, there are many examples of fixed cost, like rent is a fixed cost, insurance is a fixed cost, depreciation is a fixed cost, the business rates, they are fixed costs, a salary, it is also a fixed cost. Okay, so fixed cost is a cost that is fixed in nature. It does not depend upon the level of activity. Third cost by behavior, it's step fixed cost. Now, fixed cost was a cost that remains fixed within a certain range. Step cost or step fixed cost is a cost that remains the same within certain range, but when that range is exceeded, when that target is breached, there is a step up in the cost. There is a step up in the cost. Such a cost is known as step fixed cost. Now, let's understand this graph and this step fixed cost by an example. Now, let's say you have a warehouse. You have a warehouse and you are paying rent of $1000. That warehouse has capacity to store 100 units. So you have a warehouse, you have a space, you have a storeroom. The rent you are paying is $1000, and that storeroom can store 100 units. So as long as your level of activity is 100, you just have to pay the rent that is 1000. Simple. The cost is fixed cost. Now, what if now your production is increased and now you have to store more units? You don't have any space available in the current warehouse. So what will you do? You will, rent out, or you will, have an additional space, right? You will have an additional space. So let's say you purchase an additional space, or you rent out an additional space. So if the rent of that space, that room, that warehouse, that store is, let's say, 500, and it has a storage capacity of 50 units. So you rented out another space, you had another space on rent. Now, when your production will increase the 100 units, it means you have to store more units, and you require an additional space. So you got an additional space on a rent of $500. So it means that for next 50 units, let's say that is 150 units, your cost will increase by 500. Now your rent cost will be 1500. So when this 100 unit target is exceeded, when you are out of capacity, you have to get another space on rent. So there will be a step up, there will be an increase in a cost, and that increase is of 500. So such a cost, it is known as step fixed cost. Again, this cost will be fixed. So your total rent cost will be 1500 up to the storage capacity of 150 units. If the units are more, if you have to store more than 150 units, again you have to have another space on rent. So again there will be a step up in cost. So such a cost, it is known as step cost or step fixed cost. Another example of step fixed costs can be the salaries. Salaries, okay? A single salary is a fixed cost, but when it is salaries, it means it is a stepped cost. Let's say there's a supervisor and you are paying supervisor salary of $500, and the person is responsible for managing 50 employees, for supervision of 50 employees, okay? So when your employees are up to 50, you just have one supervisor and you are paying him the salary of $500. That's it. Cost is fixed. Now, when your employees will increase, when they will go above 50, so you have to hire another supervisor, right? Let's say you have hired 20-30 more employees. Now your total employees are 80. Now one supervisor can only manage 50 employees, okay? So for extra employees you have to hire another supervisor. So if you will hire another supervisor, you will pay him the salary as well. So let's say if the salary is same, so when your employees will increase above 50, so there will be a step up in cost. So now you have two supervisors, so you have to pay total supervisor salaries of $1,000, and the cost will be fixed up to next 50 employees. So in this way, again, when your employees will exceed 100, then you have to hire further supervisor, another supervisor, then there will be again a step up in the cost. So such type of a cost is known as step fixed cost. Now, last cost by behavior, it is semi-variable cost. Now, the name is clearly suggesting that it says it has a few portion of the variable. It shows the few characteristics of the variable cost. So such a cost that shows some characteristics of variable cost and some characteristics of fixed cost, that cost will be known as semi-variable cost. Now, how will you identify whether a cost is a semi-variable or not? So remember one thing, I just told you that variable cost, it has two characteristics. The total cost, it increases with level of activity, and cost per unit, it remains the same. These were the characteristics of variable cost. Now, what if in a question you see that there is a cost that is increasing with level of activity, but when you divide the cost with the number of units, the per unit answer is not same. So it means that that cost is showing only one characteristic of variable cost. So it means it is not completely variable, it is half variable, or you can say it is a semi-variable cost. So in this way, you will identify the semi-variable cost. Now, the graph of the semi-variable cost is in front of you. This is the graph of total semi-variable cost, okay? Now, clearly you can see that when your level of activity is 0, still there is some cost that has been incurred. So it means that this is reflecting the fixed element. Now, let's discuss it with an example, okay? Let's discuss it with an example. Now, the most common example that I can give, it's of the bills, electricity bills, telephone bills, okay? Now, in electricity bills, there is a fixed standing charge. Let's say it's $100, or you can say $50. Now, this $50 you have to pay regardless of your consumption of electricity. Even if your consumption is 0, the fixed standing charge on the bill you have to pay. So it means that this portion is your fixed cost, the $50. And then above that, the cost that depends upon the consumption. So basically, the greater the level of activity, the greater the consumption of electricity, the more will be the cost. So that is reflecting the variable characteristic. Okay, so such type of cost which have both the characteristics of fixed cost and variable cost, they are known as semi-variable cost. Another example that I can give about semi-variable cost is consider a person who is receiving a fixed salary plus he is receiving commission on the basis of the number of units he is selling. So he's getting two things, right? He's getting one salary that is fixed and the commission that depends upon the sales. So it means the more the sales, more the commission. So this part is variable. So these type of the cost, they are known as semi-variable cost. Now, if you see the cost per unit graph of the semi-variable cost, you can see two things. Number one, you can see there is a downward curved shape. And if you remember, this was this thing, it was the graph of the fixed cost per unit. So basically this curved shape downward graph, okay, this is representing the fixed cost per unit. while the variable cost per unit, it remains the same. So this straight line, it's representing the variable element. So this is representing the variable cost per unit. So cost per unit graph is the combination of both. So this was our semi-variable cost. And now our classification of cost is done. We started with the element. By element, cost was of three types: material, labor, and expense. By nature, it was of two types: direct cost and indirect cost. Direct cost was further of three types: direct material, direct labor, direct expenses. The sum of all direct costs was known as prime cost. Then there was indirect cost, which was also of further three types: indirect material, indirect labor, indirect expenses. Sum of all indirect costs was known as overheads. Then we discussed about classification by function. By function, cost was of two types: production cost and non-production cost. In production cost, all the prime costs and production overheads are included, while in the non-production cost, the non-production overheads like administration cost, selling cost, finance cost, marketing cost, distribution cost, they were all non-production cost. And then finally, we discuss about the classification by behavior. Cost was of four types by behavior: variable cost that varies with level of activity, fixed cost that remains same, step fixed cost in which there was a step up when a certain target is exceeded, and the last one is semi-variable cost, which contains both the characteristics of the fixed cost and the variable cost. Now moving on to the next topic, that is Hilo method. We just discussed about the semi-variable cost. Now Hilo method is a method that is used to split semi-variable cost into fixed and variable element. As we just discussed, that semi-variable cost contains both the characteristic of the fixed cost and the variable cost. So Hilo method is a method that helps us to split semi-variable costs into the fixed and variable element. Now, before starting the Hilo method, first you need to be familiar with this formula. The formula for total semi-variable cost is total fixed cost plus total variable cost. So, because semi-variable cost contains two things, fixed and variable element. So it means the total cost should be total fixed cost plus total variable cost, right? And the variable cost formula, the total variable cost formula can be opened up as variable cost per unit times activity level. So, you can further open up the total variable cost formula. While for the fixed cost, the fixed cost, it remains the same. So you don't need to open the formula. So this is the formula for the total semi-variable cost. Now, let's discuss the steps, and we will apply those steps in the example that is given below. Now, what's the first step? First step is you have to identify highest and lowest activity level and their relevant cost. So, for doing the Hilo method, you will be provided with different level of activities and their relevant cost. Now, first step is you have to identify what is the highest level of activity and what is the lowest level of activity and the relevant cost on those activity levels. So if I clearly look at the formula, if I look at the formula, I can clearly see that 50 units is the highest activity level and cost at highest activity level is 7310. Similarly, the lowest activity level is 26 units and cost at lowest activity level is 6566. So this is the first step in Hilo method. Now, what's the second step? You have to calculate the variable cost per unit using this formula. What is the formula for variable cost per unit? Cost at highest level of activity minus cost at lowest level of activity divided by highest level of activity minus lowest level of activity. So let's do that. Variable cost per unit is cost at highest level of activity, that is 7310. Then there is cost at lowest level of activity, that is 6566, divided by the highest activity level, that is 50, and the lowest activity level, that is 26. So if I calculate 7310 minus 6566, it gives me 744, and 50 minus 26 is 24. So the answer will be 31 per unit. So this is my variable cost per unit. Now, what's the third step? Substitute fixed cost from total cost formula. We just discussed the total cost formula, that was fixed cost plus variable cost. So from that formula, we can calculate the fixed cost. So if total cost is fixed cost plus variable cost, fixed cost will be total cost minus variable cost. If the formula for total cost was fixed cost plus variable cost, So this will go to this side of equation. Uh, so the formula will become fixed cost is equal to total cost minus variable cost. So let me write down the formula here. This was the second step. This is the third step. Fixed cost is equal to total cost minus variable cost. And I can further open up the variable cost formula, that was variable cost per unit times the level of activity or activity level or number of units. They all means the same thing, no difference. Now I know that the variable cost per unit is 31. I just calculated it. But the problem is, what is the level of activity that I should take and what is the total cost that I should take? Because I need total cost and level of activity to get the answer of fixed cost. Now it's very simple. If 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 you are taking lowest activity level inside the bracket, if you are taking lowest activity level inside the bracket, let's say I will take 26 here, then the total cost should be at the lowest activity level. So what is the total cost at lowest activity level? 6566. So you will take that outside. Similarly, if you are taking the highest one, if you are taking highest level of activity in the bracket, you have to take the total cost at highest activity level in place of total cost. Okay, so this is what you need to remember. It's up to you. You can use the lowest activity level data or the highest activity level data. In both the scenario, the answer you will be getting will be the same for fixed cost. Okay, so let's do that. 31 31 times 26, and so the fixed cost answer is 5760. So this is my fixed cost. Now you have identified the fixed cost and you have identified the variable cost per unit as well. Now you know that variable cost per unit is the constant, right? Variable cost per unit is same. And you also know that fixed cost, it remains the same. So if you have these two things, variable cost per unit and fixed cost, you can calculate the total cost at any given level of activity. Let's say in this question, he would have asked us to tell me what will be the cost at 40 units. Okay. What will be the total cost at 40 units? So simple. I know the formula for total cost, that is total cost is equal to fixed cost plus variable cost, and I can further open the variable cost formula, that is variable cost per unit times level of activity. Now I need to identify what is the total cost on 40 units. So fixed cost, it remains fixed. So 5760 will be my fixed cost. Variable cost per unit is 31. And because I want to calculate the total cost at 40 units, so I will multiply it with 40. So the answer I will be getting is 31 times 40 plus 5760. That is 7000. So in this way, you can identify the total cost at any given level of activity. So Hilo method is also useful in the forecasting. You can forecast, you can estimate, you can predict the total cost. So this was Hilo method. Now there are some other things that are included in Hilo method. The first one is Hilo method with stepped fixed cost. Now, what if, in the question, the examiner asks you that, the cost had a step up element. There was a step up element in the cost. Then how would you deal with that thing? How will you use Hilo method then? Now, let's discuss about that. What are the steps? The first one is choose two activity levels where cost remains unchanged. Or in other words, simply you have to choose those activity levels amongst the question where the fixed cost remains same, unchanged or same. They both means the same thing. So first thing is, in the question you will be given with different level of activities. You have to choose those two in which the fixed cost is same. Okay, in which the fixed cost is same, whether it is with the step up, whether it is without step up, the fixed cost should be same. Then using those activity levels, you have to calculate variable cost per unit, the formula we just discussed about the variable cost per unit. Then similarly, you have to calculate fixed cost using the formula, the total cost formula. And then the last step, important one, make adjustment to fixed cost as per requirement of the question. So according to the question scenario, you have to make some adjustments to the fixed cost. Now, let's discuss an example so that your concept, it should be clear with help of example. Now, this is an example in front of you. And the question is, you have to tell what is the total cost at an activity level of 5,000 units. So you have to tell that what is the total cost at an activity level of 5,000 units. Now, there are three activity levels that are given to you: 4,000, 6,000, 7,500, and the relevant cost on those activity levels are also provided. Variable cost per unit is constant. There is no change in variable cost within this activity range. And there is a step up of 10% in total fixed cost when activity level exceeds 5,500 units. So when your activity level is above 5,500 units, there is a 10% increase in the fixed cost. It means there is a 10% step up in the fixed cost. Now, the first step was we have to identify that at which two activity levels the fixed cost is same. Okay, the fixed cost is same. Okay, now let's say if fixed cost was 100%, fixed cost was 100%. So it means that after 5,500 units or above 5,500 units, there was 10% increase in step up. There was 10% increase in fixed cost. So the fixed cost should now be the 110%, right? After 5,500 units, the fixed cost should be 110% because there is 10% increase, right? So before 5,500, it is 100%. And after 5,500, because there is a 10% increase, so we will say that fixed cost is 110%. Now in this activity level, 4,000, the fixed cost is 100%. Now 6,000, because it's after 5,500 units, so it means that this 50,000 cost, it must include the step up element. It must have the step up element. So the fixed cost here will be equal to 110%. Similarly, the fixed cost here will be 110%. Because there is 10% in increase in there is 10% increase after 5,500 units, or when the level of activity exceeds 5,500 units. So it means that an activity level of 6,000 and 7,500, the fixed cost will be equal to 110% because there is 10% increase. Now, first step was you have to identify those activity levels where the cost remains the same. Either it's with step up or without step up. Now you can clearly see that at activity level of 6,000 and 7,500, the fixed cost is same, right? Both are equal to 110%. It means they are same, it does not matter whether it is with step up or without step up. Okay, the cost should be same. The cost should be same. Now that was the first step. So we have identified the activity levels. Now I will calculate the variable cost per unit using these activity levels. So cost at highest activity level, it's 54,800 minus cost at lowest activity level, it is 50,000 divided by highest activity level, that is 7,500, and lowest activity level, that is 6,000. So if I calculate variable cost per unit, so 4,800 divided by 1,500, 4,800 divided by 1,500 will give me 3.2. So this is my variable cost per unit. Now I have to identify what is the fixed cost. So fixed cost formula was total cost minus variable cost per unit times activity level or level of activity. Okay, so I will take, let's say, the lowest one. So that's total cost is the 50,000. You have to consider the costs, only those costs that you have used in the data, that you have used in calculation of the variable cost per unit. You can choose either of them. Variable cost per unit is 3.2. Because I have taken 50,000 as my total cost, so I will choose the relevant activity level, that is 6,000. Now let's calculate. So 3.2 times 6,000, it's 19,200 minus 50,000. So it's 30,800. So my fixed cost is 30,800. Now you have to remember this thing, that you have taken the data in which the fixed cost was equal to 110%, or in other words, in which there was step up, in which the step up element was included, right? So it means that this fixed cost, it is reflecting the 110%. It has the step up element included in it. You have to remember that. Now the last step was you have to make the adjustments in fixed cost according to the question requirement. Now what is the requirement of the question? He is asking us to calculate total cost at 5,000 units. Now, you know that the step up element is only after 5,500 units. And we have to calculate the total cost at 5,000 units. So it means that the fixed cost that we should take at 5,000 units, it must not include the step up element, because the step up element is after 5,500 units. So I will calculate the cost without step up. It's very simple. The 30,800 cost, it included the step up element. It was equal to 110%. So I will divide it with 110. And because I need the fixed cost without step up, or in other words, I need the fixed cost 100% fixed cost. So it will give me 28,000. So this is my fixed cost without step up. This is equal to the 100%. Now these are the adjustments that you need to, be aware of. So now I will summarize all the things. Okay, I will summarize all the things. We used those two. The first step was we have to identify those activity levels in which there was step up, in which the fixed cost remains the same. So those two activity levels were 6,000 and 7,500. In both of them, there was an element of the step up, and the fixed cost was same at these both two activity levels. That was 110%. I calculated variable cost per unit using that data. Then I calculated fixed cost, and I already knew that these costs that I have taken for the purpose for the calculation purpose, they include the step up element. So it means that the answer of the fixed cost, it must have included or it must have the step up element included in it. So the fixed cost that I calculated 30,800, it was equal to the 110%. Now, because I need to identify the total cost at an activity level of 5,000 units, I have to use the fixed cost without step up. So that is exactly what I did. I divided 30,800 with 110. It will give me the answer of 1%, and I require the answer at 100%. So I multiplied with 100. So I got the fixed cost without step up. Now the last thing is I will calculate the total cost that is equal to fixed cost. We have to use 28,000 without step up because activity level is 5,000 units, plus variable cost per unit, that is 3.2. And because we have to calculate the cost at 5,000 units, so I will use 5,000 here. So 5,000 times 3.2, 5,000 times 3.2, 16,000 plus 28,000, it gives me the answer of 44,000. So 44,000 is my answer. If, for example, let's say he would have asked us to calculate the total cost at 6,500 units, then we would have used this fixed cost. Simple. If in the question he has asked us to calculate, the examiner has asked us to calculate the cost at the activity level above 5,500 units, then I would have used the fixed cost with step up, that is 30,800. And if I have to calculate the total cost at the level of activity below 5,500 units, I would have used the fixed cost without step up, that is 28,000. So in this way, you have to make the adjustments. Okay. So that was the Hilo method with stepped cost. Now there is Hilo method with variable cost per unit changes. Now let's say in the question, the examiner says that there is a change in variable cost per unit, okay, after certain activity level. Now how should you deal with that? So the first step is very simple. You have to choose two activity levels where the variable cost is same, okay, where the variable cost is same, and calculate the variable cost per unit using the formula, using those two relevant activity levels. Then similarly calculate the fixed cost formula, and then afterwards you need to make the adjustment according to the question. Now here's a question in front of you. Now you can see three level of activities and the cost at the relevant activity levels. For output volume above 350 units, when your output exceeds 350 units, variable cost per unit falls by 10%. There is a 10% fall in the variable cost per unit. There is a 10% fall in the variable cost per unit. This fall applies to all units, not just excess above 350. It means that, after 350 units, when your activity level exceeds 350, all of the units, the variable cost per unit will be less than 10%, or it will fall by 10%. It's not like, that if the level of activity is 400, then only the above 350 units, 50 units, they will have fall of 10%. No, all of them will fall. Okay. Now let's start. Let's first calculate the variable cost per unit, and we have to choose two activity levels where the variable cost per unit remains the same. Because the fall is after 350 units. So it means we cannot use the 400 because in this the fall element will be included. So we have to use 200 and 300 as our activity levels because here the variable cost per unit it is same. Okay. So I will calculate the variable cost per unit. It will be 8,000 minus 7,000 divided by 300 minus 200. So variable cost per unit will be 10. I will calculate the fixed cost using the total cost formula. Total cost minus variable cost per unit times level of activity. So total cost, let's say I'm taking 8,000 as my total cost. Variable cost per unit is 10 and the relevant activity level at 8,000 is 300. So my fixed cost will be 5,000. Now finally I have to calculate the total cost at 450 units. So fixed cost it's 5,000. Now we have to adjust the variable cost per unit. Why? Because I know that after 350 units, the variable cost per unit falls by 10%. So if my variable cost per unit was 10, after 350 units, it will be equal to 90% because there is 10% fall in variable cost. So it means my variable cost after 350 units will be 9. So I will use 9 here. So my answer will be 5,000 plus 4,050. That will be 9,050. So this is my total cost at 450 units. So again, the concept is exactly the same. If the requirement was to calculate the cost at an activity level below 350 units, then you would have used 10 as your variable cost per unit. But if in the question he asked you to calculate the total cost at an activity level above 350 units, then you have to use this 9 as your variable cost per unit. So that was your Hilo method.